Welcome to this talk and thank you for listening. My name is Christina Ruano-Chamorro and I'm a PhD candidate at the ARC Center of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University. Today I will talk about advancing gender equality in coral reef socio-ecological systems. And this is a project I've been working on for the last few months with Jacqueline Lau from the ARC Center of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies, James Cook University and WorldFish, and Carl Dering from CARE International. Coral reefs support one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world and provide goods and services for 500 million people in coastal communities globally. Yet climate change is threatening the sustainability of coral reefs, is changing food systems, decreasing productivity, and increasing the vulnerability of people depending on reefs for their livelihoods. The effects of social and ecological changes are unequally distributed on gender. Gender, the social meaning and expectations regarding what is to be a woman or a man, shapes how individuals experience opportunities and outcomes within social ecological systems. For instance, women tend to have less access and control over assets and resources than men. Women have mobility constraints, they are responsible for domestic labor, and therefore they have generally less capacity to adapt to social ecological change. Furthermore, how women and men engage with programs and policies seeking to overcome social ecological impacts is also gender. Women tend to have less access to information and support, less flexibility to participate in alternative livelihoods, and less ability to participate in decision-making processes. In order to ensure that conservation development and management projects lead to effective and equitable outcomes, it is critical that these projects address these inequities. Yet there is still a lack of gender research on livelihoods in coral reef-dependent communities and a lack of understanding of how to address these inequalities. Projects and interventions can promote gender equity in different ways. Research has identified that approaches to gender equality can fall across a spectrum from projects that seek to reach participants to projects that seek to transform. Approaches that reach tend to focus on ensuring women and men are included in interventions. For example, these projects ensure equal number of women and men are participating in projects and activities. Approaches that benefit focus on providing individual access to resources and benefits, for instance, by increasing productivity or income generation. Approaches that empower focus on building women's and men's agency and promote their ability to make and act on decisions. Given that women have less agency than men, these projects often focus on empowering women. Finally, transformative projects seek to transform the underlying causes of gender inequality, such as unequal power dynamics and structures that reinforce gender inequalities, such as gender norms. Projects or interventions that only reach, benefit, and empower participants are targeting the symptoms of gender inequality by focusing on visible gender differences, such as what women and men have and do. In this metaphor of the atoll, these approaches will be operating above the waterline. The problem is that these approaches may only affect women that are engaged in the project, and they may only achieve superficial changes that may not be sustained once the project ends. Besides, sometimes these projects can lead to perverse outcomes, such as increasing women's workload or reinforcing gender stereotypes. On the other hand, transformative approaches also operate below the waterline because they seek to transform the underlying causes of gender inequality. For instance, transformative approaches challenge how society says men and women should behave or how society values women and men. Gender transformative approaches are considered the frontier of gender best practice because by operating above and below the waterline, they can realize more transformative and long-lasting process towards gender equality. However, there is still a big gap in understanding to what extent gender transformative approaches have been applied in coral reef social ecological systems. We really need to fill this gap because projects such as the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative are really taking a people-centered focus on how to build resilience in coral reef social ecological systems, and they want to understand how to do it effectively and equitably. The Coral Reef Rescue Initiative is a global partnership of development and conservation organizations led by WWF, which aims to protect and regenerate coral reefs, food security, and livelihoods against climate change. And they do this in countries with coral reefs that have been identified as highly resilient, which means that they have the potential to survive in the future conditions of warming ocean. These countries are Tanzania, Madagascar, Philippines, Solomon Islands, and Fiji. This project starts next year and it will run for a decade. So this is a window of opportunity that can be used to think, reflect, generate capacity and plan how to promote gender equitable resilience in coral reef socio-ecological systems globally. We are contributing to this process with a project that has the overall aim of increasing awareness and knowledge among coral reef rescue initiative partners on the relevance and importance of gender transformative approaches in coral reef socio-ecological systems. We began by focusing on understanding how gender equity has been promoted in coral reef socio-ecological systems, and we examined to what extent these projects have been gender transformative. This will help us to identify gaps and inform future practice. For this, we conducted a literature review on gender equality-related projects in coral reef socio-ecological systems in the countries targeted by the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative. And we reviewed peer-reviewed and grade literature. We looked at interventions that were implemented across these 4 impact pathways because they all impact resilience in some ways, and they all have implications for gender equity in coral reef socio-ecological systems. These pathways were alternative or improved livelihoods initiatives, initiatives to build adaptive capacity to shocks, conservation initiatives to preserve biodiversity, and management initiatives to ensure sustainability. In order to see if the interventions were gender transformative approaches, we drew on CARE Gender Equality Framework, which identifies 3 critical domains for realizing gender equality. The first one is building agency to empower individuals to take steps to achieve their rights. This can be done informally through building self-esteem, consciousness, and aspirations, and formally through capacity, knowledge, and skill building. The second dimension is changing power relations, and this can be done informally in intimate relationships and social networks, and formally through group membership, activism, citizenship, and market relations. The third dimension is transforming structures, such as discriminatory social norms or gender norms, customs, values, and exclusionary practices, and in the more formal sphere, challenging policies, procedures, and services. These 3 domains feed back into one another, and promoting one can promote other dimensions. An intervention is gender transformative when it targets the 3 dimensions. For instance, if an approach only focuses on building agency without transforming structures or changing relationships of power, this cannot be considered a gender transformative approach. Broadly, we found that studies on gender are rare in tropical seascapes, but there is increasing attention. Many studies of gender were concerned with small-scale fisheries, but fewer were concerned with coral reef-based livelihoods. There were no studies focused directly on gender equity and resilience, and we found literature on the practical application and research into gender transformative approaches. We found some projects engaging with different dimensions of the CARE's Gender Equality Framework, and I wanted to take you through a summary of the overall approaches we did find and give an example of one of the most successful approaches that we found. Gender equity projects overall focus on promoting access to financial resources such as saving clubs or microcredits, providing training, increasing women's leadership, promoting women associations and networks, promoting alternative livelihoods, market access, providing family planning services, and promoting equitable participation in management and conservation. Some projects targeted one or several of these aspects, and they were implemented most of the time through 2 or more impact pathways. For instance, promoting alternative livelihoods was often promoted through all the pathways together. Seaweed farming, for instance, was promoted as an alternative income opportunity for women when temporary closures or marine parks were implemented. Several projects did address some elements of the gender equality framework, but rarely interventions were holistic enough to progress all 3 domains. In general, projects tend to reach, benefit, and empower women through the 4 impact pathways. Therefore, they were addressing gender inequalities above the waterline. Few projects were gender transformative. In other words, they were addressing gender inequities above the waterline and not addressing the underlying and invisible causes of gender inequities. We found 2 projects that were more transformative, but due to time limitations, I will only describe one. The Tega Project is the Tanga Coastal Zone Conservation and Development Program. and aim to empower local people in coastal management and conservation and employed an integrated gender approach throughout the 4 impact pathways. The project had several gender transformative elements. It engaged men and women in discussions about the lack of women participation in management, and as a result, participants identified that the lack of participation was due to restrictive norms and customs, and suggested that the projects may have promoted critical consciousness, which is one of the mechanisms to challenge gender norms that are commonly used in gender transformative approaches. The project also promoted equity awareness and responsibilities at multiple scales. It promoted women and men's agency and participation. It promoted gender equity accountability. And it also increased equitable representation at all levels and women's leadership. So overall, the project focused on building agency, changing relationships, and transforming structures by challenging gender norms, making institutions and individuals responsible for gender equity, encouraging women's leadership and responsibility in monitoring, and promoting equitable representation at all levels. The holistic nature of the project resulted in gender equality outcomes such as an increase in gender awareness, it shifted gender attitudes, it promoted gender equity in fisheries management, and it also promoted women's empowerment and access to alternative livelihoods. It also led to resilience outcomes such as stakeholder awareness and understanding of marine resources. It increased community engagement and decision-making power. It also increased support for reef closure, increased stakeholder representation, and also increased catches and improved livelihoods. This highlights the benefits that gender transformative approaches can have in promoting equitable and resilient livelihoods. In conclusion, several projects did address some elements of the gender equality framework, but rarely interventions are holistic enough to progress all 3 domains. So what are the next steps? There is a need to better understand gender dynamics in coral reef socio-ecological systems. There is also a need to better understand how to promote gender transformative approaches in these systems, trial and evaluate them. We have contributed to address these needs by developing a good practice paper guide that can help practitioners to better understand and promote gender transformative approaches in coral reef socio-ecological systems. And it also can help them to ensure that future development, conservation, and management interventions and programs, such as the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative, promote gender equity and resilience in coral reef socio-ecological systems across the globe. There is also a need to create policies that support the implementation of gender transformative approaches. We have also contributed to this by developing a policy brief highlighting the importance of gender transformative approaches for policy influencers in national governments, donors, and multilateral agencies supporting gender equality and equitable livelihoods in coral reef socio-ecological systems.